Have you ever seen a movie? Watched a TV show? Then hey, you've seen the incredible work of my next guest, GREG NICOTERO. He's been the makeup effects artist for more than 200 movies and TV shows, including The Walking Dead, and such Stephen King adaptations like Misery, The Mist, The Green Mile, and Creepshow. Here are a few more movies he's worked on. You may have heard of them. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Annabelle, Sin City, Django Unchained, Jennifer's Body, Inglourious Basterds, Transformers, Kill Bill, Mulholland Drive, Boogie Nights, Men in Black, and Pulp Fiction.
Check out the big brain on Brad.
His work speaks for itself. Luckily, he also speaks for himself. Here's my chat with makeup effects guru, GREG NICOTERO. GREG NICOTERO, welcome to the Stephen Kingdom. So you, probably more than any of our other guests, have intersected with Stephen King and his works just a countless number of times throughout your career. But do you have a first memory of him?
Well, I can pretty much remember seeing Carrie when it came out. I hadn't read the book, but I was and still am a pretty voracious horror movie buff. So I remember watching Carrie when it came out. And that was my first exposure to Stephen King. And my mom loves to read. So I read all of his books that were available at the time. I think Salem's Lot is probably one of my favorite books of his, just in terms of just sheer terror. I think Pet Sematary was probably, aside from Salem's Lot, the book that had the most impact on me. I read it in one day. I was pretty ravenous for anything that he wrote because of the fact that, when horror movies would come out, I was always constantly looking to keep that spirit of horror and terror and suspense up. So I became a big fan of Stephen King's right at the beginning, and a lot of other writers at the time, Willie Stryber and F. Paul Wilson and, a lot of those folks who had a big influence on me.
The breadth of King's work is so vast, and he writes about so many types of horror. So what was it about King's particular style of writing that kept you coming back?
I always looked at it as his main character was somebody very relatable.
Yeah.
Also, in a lot of instances, out of their element, whether they were flawed, like Jack Torrance with his alcoholism, there was always something relatable about it. I think that's probably one of the reasons why he responded so well to The Walking Dead when The Walking Dead first came out, because it was layered with a bunch of sort of everyday characters that found themselves in this completely unique and unimaginable situation. And it's what that situation does to those people that is what defines his work, and defines it well, to the point of you put yourself in that character's place to try to determine what you would do if you were in that situation. And the idea of these relatable characters, the kids from Stand By Me, every character from The Stand, they're just relatable, everyday people. They don't have superhuman powers. They might be telepathic in some instances, but in most cases, the characters were relatable. So you immediately found yourself identifying with one or more of the people in the books that then sort of pulled you in. And once you were in, you were invested, and you needed to know how it was going to end. You needed to know who was going to live and who was going to die. And I love how rich they are. There's just nothing like being submerged in his world from his work.
And in addition to his individual characters he writes so well, he's also incredible at writing towns and settings and worlds. For instance, Derry feels like a real lived-in place, and there's so much history, you feel like you're actually there.
It's such a unique talent to be able to create a world. It's almost like he's writing a screenplay long form. He wants you to stand in the middle of the room and look to your left and see what's out the window, and look to your right and see what's on the stove and smell what's on the stove. it really is a completely immersive experience reading one of his books. And I just think that's the way he creates his worlds. It's almost as if nothing is left to the imagination when you read his books. So uniquely, when you talk to somebody else who's also read the book, he's done such an intricate job of layering the world that other people that could live in completely opposite sides of the country are having the same experience. I mean, that's kind of unheard of. It's the gift that he has that I think is, one or two in a million.
So what was the first project of his you worked on? Was it Creepshow 2?
I would probably say that Creepshow 2 was the first time that we had worked together when we shot the Hitchhiker episode, because the first 2 episodes were shot in Prescott, Arizona, and then we moved to Maine to shoot the Hitchhiker. That was the first time that I met him.
So when you were starting out, did you have your sights set on, I must work on a Stephen King adaptation at some point? Were you pretty aggressive in trying to worm your way into the world of his adaptations?
I never really actively thought because back then I was just happy to be in the business. It sort of took me where I went. I would honestly say the one project that I really did pursue was The Stand, McGarris's version of The Stand in the early 90s. Because I had worked with Richard Rubenstein on Day of the Dead and Creepshow 2 and Tales from the Dark Side. I'd worked with Richard a lot, and I really wanted to work on The Stand. So I flew to New York and did a big presentation with Richard, but McGarris had already committed to Steve Johnson. I was just excited about working on that particular movie. Steve did a great job and Mick did an amazing job. I love that miniseries. So there were instances that there were Stephen King projects that I had actively pursued. Fortunately, a lot of them, we had the good fortune to get hired and work on them,
So you've mentioned several of his books and stories that just didn't pan out for you to work on for one reason or another, like Pet Sematary and The Stand. But are there any other stories that you would just kill to work on if they were ever adapted?
When Creepshow was greenlit, Steve was the first person that I reached out to, and he said, I got the perfect story for you. And he gave me Survivor Type as the story that we could use. And so I wrote the screenplay based on the short story. And then when the realities of our production budget hit home, I thought, well, we're never going to be able to film this. I mean, we can't go to a lake in Georgia and digitally remove the horizon. We would have to either make the island and put blue screen all around it, or we'd have to go to a real location, which we didn't have the ability to do either of those. So I reached out to Steve and said, look, I love Gray Matter. I've always loved that story. How do you feel about us adapting that for season 1 of Creepshow? And he said, great, that sounds good. And then we ended up doing Survivor Type as an animated episode. And then of course I got Kiefer, who was very excited because he's like, dude, this is my whole career. Comes full circle. I started with Stand By Me and now here I am doing Stephen King again. So, the Stephen King web stretches vast and captures a lot of interesting people in it. And it's kind of like that sort of shared experience. We've all had the great opportunity to work together. We've all had the great opportunity, I like to call it, the Mutual Admiration Society. And, given my history and my pedigree with Steve and with George Romero, Creepshow, I feel like Creepshow, I have a responsibility to George's legacy and to everything that Steve's done to continue to celebrate his contribution to pop culture and literature. So I'm honored that I'm able to keep doing it. We didn't go for a Stephen King story in season 3 only because I didn't want to keep ringing his doorbell and going, hey buddy, can I have another story? I just feel weird about that kind of stuff. I'm honored that he gave us Survivor Type, and I'm honored that he gave us Gray Matter. And for me, I think more fun was pairing Steve and Joe Hill together and doing Twittering, because we were having a call at AMC, and I was like, wait a minute, let's do a father and son sort of celebration of everything that's Joe and everything that's Steve. And I was really proud of that. I was really grateful to be able to do that.
Especially since Joe was the boy in the original Creepshow, wasn't he?
I hope you rot in hell.
And look, I mean, I've read almost everything that Joe's written. You know, I mean, I read Horns and I read Heart-Shaped Box and Nosferatu and The Fireman, and you know, his shorts, you know, a couple of his short stories we've adapted. And it's interesting that the flavor and the style of writing, the way Joe writes is very reminiscent of his dad's, but also he's got his own voice.
You were talking about Stephen King being the nexus of meeting so many people throughout your career. And I've heard that from other people as well, that through King, either directly or through his works, their careers have just grown by leaps and bounds. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit more, particularly the huge influence King has had on the world of horror literature and film.
Well, you know, he is the preeminent horror author. I remember him saying to me when we were shooting Creepshow 2 that his goal was he wanted to write 100 books. He's like, that's my goal. And I think at that point he had written 30. I haven't actually done the math to see where he's ended up now, but that was something that he said to me that I'll never forget, that he wanted to write 100 books. So interestingly enough, you know, the people that were attracted to his material, I think initially were also people in the horror genre, you know. So having kind of come into that world, you would have these projects that sort of opened his brand up to a wider audience, you know, not necessarily the horror audience, like The Green Mile and like Shawshank Redemption. And, you know, there were a lot of horror genre directors that wanted to adapt a King story, but looked at his material as a way to sort of shed some of the genre tropes by being able to sort of broaden the horizon. I think Misery, without a doubt, is a horror story, but it doesn't have supernatural elements to it. And I think, you know, having Rob Reiner and Kathy Bates and Jimmy Kahn and those people in it, they take a lot of what is connected with Stephen King and they're able to sort of strip some of that away. Because, you know, the sad reality of our existence is people that like horror. And people, you know, you have so many people go, oh yeah, I don't really like, I had a friend of mine, yeah, I don't really like horror. So they will immediately assume and make these assumptions of like why they won't watch a TV show or why they won't read a book. Oh, I just don't like that. And what they don't realize is they're actually denying themselves the experiences of going on these journeys that these amazing writers or these amazing directors create because they say they don't like it. But they're lumping it all together. So when you have opportunities to sort of spread your wings a little bit and open up material to readers or viewers to broaden their horizons, that's a great opportunity. And I think that a lot of Steve's work, we were able to do that by introducing movies like Shawshank and The Green Mile to a broader audience. You know, I mean, Shawshank Redemption is one of the classic pieces of literature and cinema of our generation. Then you have people that watch that movie or read that book and then they go, oh, that was really good. And then they sort of go back and then they want to kind of start experiencing other elements of that author's work.
Yeah.
It's like sitting somebody down and goes, I don't really like Halloween. Like, come on, let's watch one scary movie or let's go to this haunted house. No, I don't really like it. That to me that's tragic to me. I'm like, come on, you might like it. I'm like the person like, come on, we're gonna go to a haunted house tonight and hope for the best. You know, it could backfire on me.
I did have one more question for you, since you have the unique and incredible perspective of working with Stephen King so many times throughout your career. I've heard over and over from other people I've talked to just what a kind and generous person he is. And, you know, you were speaking about how he's so open and giving of, you know, like, yeah, sure, adapt this story or this one. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about, you know, his character as a person and his seemingly boundless generosity and openness.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. In the last, since I was a kid, there was a real stigma attached with being a fan of horror. You know, a lot of movies that would come out, you know, like Dawn of the Dead was unrated. There was a big string of films in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s that were unrated. So you know, it was subversive almost. And so if you were a fan of the horror genre, you were kind of like looked at. I was definitely in high school looked at as like this weird kid who likes horror stuff, you know? So there definitely was this stigma attached to horror, which had a subversive element, you know, to it. But interestingly enough, because of, I call it the rise of the nerd, you know, the rise of Comic-Con and the rise of the popularity of people being comfortable feeling a little different because they liked something different or they stood for something different. And our world is all about that now. You know, people are comfortable to stand up and talk about what they're interested in or what they like or what they don't like. They're comfortable doing that. And, you know, for a long time, people that like the horror genre were always kind of sort of ostracized and looked at as kind of weirdos. And that has, without a doubt, significantly changed over the last, I would say, 3 decades. So I think the people that would look at Steve King that way 30 years ago definitely don't look at him that way now, because of the fact that, you know, there is a celebration of genre material, and that goes with sci-fi, that goes with fantasy, that goes with, you know, horror, everything. So I think with Steve, he was just that kind of guy. He was that kind of kid who just had a lot of stories to tell, loved telling them, was very prolific. So his books would come out, and it seemed like every time you thought you had read everything that was on the shelf, there's a new one. And horror fans are loyal. You know, you're talking about people that will fly to Washington, D.C. just to stand at the foot of the steps in Georgetown from The Exorcist, or go to Martha's Vineyard where they filmed Jaws. You know, horror fans are loyal. They're devoted, and they can't get enough. So for somebody as prolific and generous as Steve to continue to turn out material for his fans and continue to make his fans feel like they're part of this, they're on this journey with him. You know, he never ostracized or alienated the people that loved his material. You know, he embraced his fans, and probably at a time, he was probably one of the first people that was not only accessible to his fans, but then found himself partnering with like-minded people, you know, with Bernie Wrightson, when Bernie Wrightson would do all the drawings for Cycle of a Werewolf or The Stand, you know, or George Romero, where, you know, him and George were sitting around talking about how much they love DC Comics. They're like, hey, we should do a movie together, you know. It's that passion that he has that draws other like-minded, passionate people to him. So I think not just being an amazing writer, but I really do feel that Steve was a trailblazer for people who may have not necessarily felt that comfortable or that welcome expressing what they like or what they love or what they're fans of. I think he made people feel comfortable and confident that they had the right to like or support or follow something that at that time was a bit subversive.
Well, Greg, your story is so inspiring, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, thanks.
If you like the Stephen Kingdom here on YouTube, don't forget to check out the Stephen Kingdom podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, if you like what we're doing over here at the Stephen Kingdom and would like to show us a little monetary love, our Patreon has all sorts of exclusive goodies for our supporters, including extended and deleted scenes, behind-the-scenes featurettes, early access to episodes, and your name in the credits. Long days and pleasant nights, Constant Watchers.